Alright, so forgive my formatting. I don't really post to 4chan a whole lot, I usually just lurk X. But since the holidays, I've been able to hear more stories from my dad, so I think y'all might enjoy. The first couple are from my grandpa. I had heard stories about my grandpa ever since I was a kid. He was my dad's dad and had experienced a lot in life, and this in turn generated some of the most amazing stories I'd ever heard in my childhood. After the Korean War, he became a law enforcement officer in Lubbock, Texas in the late 50s, being the first Hispanic to be employed in the Texas civil service system there. And then from 1960 to 67, he served as a Texas Border Patrol agent, becoming one of the first of 5 Hispanics to be employed by that agency up to that time. He later worked for the U.S. Customs Agency Service and the DEA in the 70s. My dad always told me some amazing stories, and not all of them fit here, and some are not for me to share. But he asked too that although did not happen to him, had been told to my dad, who later told them to me, in pretty good detail. So the next 2 stories take place between 1960 and 67. My dad's family was living in the southwest Texas town of Eagle Pass, which is a border town that borders the Mexican city of Piedras Negras. My grandpa was doing border patrol work there and in the nearby border towns that are scattered along the Rio Grande River. The Sand Trap. Now before I get into the first story, I have to explain what a sand trap is. It's not necessarily a trap exactly. There are some spots along the Rio Grande that are low enough to cross over without much effort. These areas are patrolled but can't be monitored 24/7, especially back then. So sometimes immigrants pass through without detection. In places where the brush wasn't too thick, they would throw down layers of sand and smooth it out. This allowed them to monitor and count footprints and track who or how many people were crossing the river and into the US. My grandpa worked the morning shift and arrived at the station to supposedly catch up on paperwork and get some coffee. That's where he found the late night officer, who I'll refer to as Mr. L, at the station, back from his post earlier than he should have. He was pale and looking very distraught. Grandpa asked Mr. L what his deal was and was told the following story. Mr. L had been hearing rumors of some creepy posts out in Del Rio, a town about an hour north of Eagle Pass. Essentially, there was a low point in the river where immigrants would cross and enter private ranch land. Multiple border patrol agents would be sent to check the sand trap there to see if anything was turning up, but they never got any footprints. They needed someone out there to monitor it more closely. However, nobody wanted to stay after dusk. The area was rumored to be unsettling and quite possibly haunted. Mr. L thought that was a crock of shit. My dad describes Mr. L as a very tall man, shaved head, and very tough. The kind of person that doesn't take any bullshit. He decided he would go out there himself at night and show these other guys that they're just being a bunch of sissies. He drives to the Del Rio station and starts getting ready. A lot of the guys were telling him to not worry about it. They can just check the trap in the morning for footprints, and showed obvious signs of concern. But of course, he brushed it off and was handed a large ring of keys. The keys were to unlock the multiple ranch gates in the county, as he would be driving deep into the middle of nowhere and through multiple properties. He got into his service vehicle, made sure he had all the supplies he needed, and took down the old country road, and then would later turn off to the gated ranch road. It took him over an hour of passing through multiple gates and driving unkempt dirt roads just to get to the spot. He left in the late afternoon, and by the time he arrived at the post, dusk was just upon him. He said the spot was loaded with mesquite, creosote, and all sorts of brush. You couldn't walk through the brush unless you had a bush hog tractor clear the place out. There was, however, a small worn path leading from the river that you could get through just barely. This is where the sand trap was placed, since it served as a choke point for any foot traffic. Of course, the trap is devoid of any footprint, so he settles down and waits for nightfall. The night was pretty uneventful. The moon was out and lit up the area in a dim, ethereal light. The air was still, and despite being out in the middle of nowhere in Texas, there weren't many of the usual night sounds he was accustomed to. He says he would have fallen asleep, but the lack of sound kept him on edge and made him unnecessarily anxious. At around 3 or 4 a.m., he was getting the feeling that maybe this spot wasn't so bad after all, and his anxiety was just from hearing rumors. Then he heard the faint sound of footsteps. He put out his cigarette and tightened his grip on his .357 Magnum sidearm. The sound of brush being pushed away and footsteps got closer. The moon was lower now and it was very dark, but he could see the silhouettes of 3 men coming into view. They emerged from the brush, but something was off about their appearance. He thought maybe it was the lack of light, but their silhouettes were pitch black. It was dark, but these forms looked like they were darker than the night. Their eyes were glowing, similar to how a cat's would if you shined a light at their face in the dark. He called out to them, but they kept moving, ignoring his commands to freeze. They walk in single file, slowly ambling along the path. He points his vehicle's spotlight at them and feels his blood run cold. The forms looked like shadows cast on a wall in a Muppet show. He said it looked like someone was walking in front of his spotlight, but the shadows that were cast were disembodied and didn't belong to anything. He stood in awe and fear for probably 45 minutes. The forms were gone and there was no longer any sound coming from the brush. He went down to check the sand trap and found that it was still smooth, and it was like nobody had ever crossed the area. He suddenly felt dreadful and as though something was watching him. The feeling wouldn't go away and he started to feel fearful. He got in his vehicle and left. He drove straight to Eagle Pass, and since my grandpa came in early, he heard everything from the now shaken Mr. L. My grandpa didn't have a fun time as Mr. L didn't bother to lock the numerous ranch gates behind him. I wish I could say this is a fun part of the story, where my grandpa goes over there to close it for him and see the spot for himself. But he had stuff to do and delivered the keys back to the Del Rio station and let them take care of it. Mr. L never went back to that area, but he stopped making fun of his fellow colleagues' stories. Funnily enough, not much changed about him. He wasn't scared of anything and was a mean guy all around. But whenever Mr. L retold the story at later times, my dad could tell that it was an event that really shook him. My grandpa continued to hear stories about the remote Del Rio post, but over time he heard less about it as he was given assignments that took him away from that town. He believes it was haunted and people said it was an evil place, and although they never caught anybody in the area in his 7 years as a border patrol agent, there surely was something crossing over. This was another one of my grandpa's border patrol stories. It's another one that didn't happen to my grandpa, but was told by his colleagues as they were exchanging stories one morning at the station. His colleague, who we will call Angus, was another one of those true Texan, no bullshit types. He graduated from Texas A&M University, was a bona fide cowboy, and worked as a hand ranch for years before coming onto the Texas Border Patrol. He would patrol ranches and other properties near the border on horseback, and would monitor sand traps and look for anything or anyone suspicious. This one instance took place near Rio Grande City. He was on horseback in the middle of nowhere on a ranch in Starr County, Texas. The sun was hot and he hadn't come across anything or anybody for hours. He was miles away from any service road, much less a county road, and he started to get thirsty. He took a quick break to drink some water and got his horse hydrated too. He wiped the sweat off the brow when maybe 500 feet away, he saw the figure moving across the plains at a decent pace. He took a sip out of the canteen and got his binoculars out. He could see it was an older man, with a cowboy hat, riding a horse at a slight trot. Angus closed his canteen and put his binoculars back around his neck. He radioed in the incident and mounted his horse and took off after the person. Hoping to intercept them, he started off with the horse at a full gallop, kicking up dust behind him. The area was hilly and he passed a bend and saw that the rider was now further away than he was before. Confused but determined, Angus drove his spurs into the side of the horse to goad it into going faster. They started to gain ground on the other rider. He disappeared around another bend, but Angus was close behind him. When Angus came around the bend, he saw that the rider was now even further away. Angus started to get pissed off. Obviously the guy was fucking with him and he was ready to apprehend him. He gets his horse to go even faster. His hat was barely hanging on and everything was shaking and starting to come loose from the holster and bags. He gained on the figure yet again, but after another bend the figure came even further away. He had never made his horse go this fast. Its grunts were harsh and labored. After each bend the figure got further and further away until it finally disappeared. For fear of his horse's safety, he decided to call off the pursuit and radioed in that the suspect had gotten away. He dismounted and gave his horse some water. They had probably traveled about 5 to 10 miles from where they originally spotted the lone horseback rider. He decided to double back. He started to notice that the only tracks were his own. No other tracks but the ones from his horse were found the whole way back. He told everyone on the Mick Allen horseback unit about it and asked if they'd ever experienced anything like it, but not one of them believed him. Said it was just a mirage or he had a heat stroke. Angus assured them that he knew the signs of heat stroke and his limits. He had been a ranch hand for years after all. He wouldn't have continued if he knew he was not well enough to do so. He let it go for a little while, but told my grandpa eventually. When he did some work in Eagle Pass, he never seemed scared about it, but perplexed. He continued working in the area of Starr County, but never experienced anything like that ever again.